Okay, it looks like our attendee numbers are slowing down a bit and plateauing, so we'll go ahead and get started. We might have a few more trickle in, but that's okay. Once again, thank you everybody for joining us. We're really excited to have you here for this webinar. Today, we're going to take a look at the newest release of IMPLAN Canada. We're going to talk about what is in IMPLAN Canada, some of the key features you need to think about. We're going to talk about the new features. In particular, take a close look at our occupation and environmental data. And then we're going to take a look at a real world analysis that shows you how you can use all of this together. My name is Eric Clower. I'm the Director of Education Services here at IMPLAN, and I am joined today by Ashley Bickel, our International Economic Data Developer. If you have any questions today, please put those in the Q&A box. We are very happy to have an interactive webinar. We love to answer questions, and we'll save some time at the end to address those. We also have a few interactive polls throughout, just another way for you to share some of your thoughts and for us to see how you're working with IMPLAN and what you want to see in IMPLAN. And then I just want to let everybody know that if we don't get to your questions, we will be sure to follow up after the webinar. With that housekeeping done, let's go ahead and dive into our plan for today. So our main objective today is really to familiarize you with IMPLAN Canada and to show you what's new and what you can do with it. We'll cover the geographic and industry coverage of IMPLAN. We'll walk through the new occupation and environmental data, and then I'll show you a hands-on demo that hopefully will inspire you for some of your own use cases. And then finally, we'll close out with our Q&A. To start off, I want to set the stage just by covering some of the key characteristics of IMPLAN Canada. This is a really cool product, and it offers a lot of flexibility to see the big picture of impacts across the entire country, all the way down to the sub-provincial granularity. I just hit on this a little bit, but since identifying your region of interest is going to be one of the first steps in your economic impact analysis, it's also going to be my starting point today. You can see here that at the top, IMPLAN Canada allows you to run economic impact analysis at the national Canadian level, but it also allows you to break that down into 10 provinces and its 3 territories, or we have even more granularity with 76 economic regions. These 76 economic regions are relatively new, this sub-provincial data, and this is something that Ashley and I actually covered in a previous webinar, which you can watch from the support site if you are interested. After we take a look at the where, after we answer the question of where in our impact analysis, and we need to start to think about what makes up the economy. And that's what's captured in the industry scheme associated with our product. If you are used to working with the US product, there's probably a couple key differences that you see here. First of all, the IMPLAN Canada data uses its own specific industry setup. You see different industries than you do with the US product and different industries than you would with the international product. It has 235 what we call functional industries, plus one very specific category for taxes on products net of subsidies. That's such a big mouthful that we refer to that as TOPS. The TOPS category is just for accounting purposes, and we're going to see this in a couple places today throughout our webinar, what TOPS looks like and how it's integrated into the data. But for your sake, you can think of it kind of like an accounting-only industry. It's a holding tank for our taxes on products net of subsidies. Other key features that are going to be important to remember outside of the geographies and the industries. First, IMPLAN Canada represents all monetary values in Canadian dollars. It expects project inputs in Canadian dollars, and it returns results in Canadian dollars. Everything is reported in basic prices. So the easiest way for me to think about this is that this is the amount received by the producer, and it reflects what the producer retains after taxes and subsidies. There's a lot of information on our support site about different valuation methods. This is important to note out because, again, this is a distinct feature in the IMPLAN Canada and international products. IMPLAN Canada is released annually in accordance with the Statistics Canada, and Ashley's going to talk a little bit more about that process of how the data is developed and put to use in IMPLAN. And then finally, with this new release, there's now environment and occupation satellite data available, which we are very excited about, and Ashley's going to talk about that a little bit more in depth as well. The final point that I want to bring up here is also that if you need to access the Canadian data, you can do that through creating a new project. When you create a new project, you'll see something like this come up, which will allow you to select your industry set. And this is where you can select the 236 industries from Canada. Again, we have a lot of information about accessing the data set and how to get to that on our support site. This is particularly relevant if you have multiple IMPLAN products that you're working with. Okay, so at this point, we're going to start a quick poll to get a feel for how many of you are using IMPLAN Canada already or have use cases for IMPLAN Canada. So I've gone ahead and started that poll. If you want to participate, that would be great. We'd love to hear how you're using or if you're using IMPLAN Canada already. All right, good. We've got some responses coming in. All right. Interesting. Responses are slowing down, so we'll go ahead and end the poll. It looks like the majority of you here have not yet used IMPLAN Canada. That is fine. That's what we're here for, is to inspire you and show you what IMPLAN Canada is about. So hopefully after today, you'll have some ideas and you'll take a closer look at what you can do with IMPLAN Canada. All right, and now I am going to hand it off to Ashley, who is going to talk a little bit more in depth about what is new in IMPLAN Canada and our data process.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thank you all for being here today. So as Eric mentioned, my name is Ashley Bickel, and I am the International Economic Data Developer here at IMPLAN. And I'm excited to talk about all of the new Canada data and highlight some of the lesser known data and features. So let's go ahead and get started with what is new in the 2022 data. So if you have been a Canada user for a while, you'll notice that we do have a new sectoring scheme. The IMPLAN sectoring scheme has changed from 235 industries to 236 industries. This is due to a change in the number of industries covered by our primary raw data source, which is the Statistics Canada provincial level input-output tables. And they have reduced the number of industries to 220. The impetus for these changes was to align with changes related to the 2022 NAICS codes, which have been revised to better reflect the digital economy. So, for example, one of the new industries that we have now is called media streaming distribution services and other media content providers. Quite a mouthful. Likewise, one of the industries that has been deprecated is non-store retailers, which had separately classified internet retail, direct selling, and mail order retail from brick and mortar retail. So IMPLAN has been able to increase the industry scheme by one, incorporating that new industry data for those two new industries from Statistics Canada, and then preserve historically existing industries for as much as we're able. So we were able to do that for all industries except non-store retailers, which no longer has a NAICS code, and therefore we no longer have raw employment data for. So this combination of expansions and deprecations has resulted in a new implant industry set of 236 industries. And I'll just quickly note that the 2022 data year is the first time in which the implant industry set for is different from Statistics Canada. Next slide, please. So another change you'll see with the 2022 data is in the detailed tax impact report. So you can see here that the tax impact report has a new column for taxes on products. So this is a new institution that we have implemented, and it allows for the separation of taxes paid by industries for engaging in production, which is OTXS, and taxes paid when a product is produced or sold, which is TOPS. So again, OTXS are taxes that are paid by industries, and they're paid regardless of production and sales. So this include things like property taxes, government license, and payroll taxes. So even if an industry makes no sales whatsoever, they are responsible for paying these taxes. TOPS, on the other hand, are paid both by industries and by final consumers. And so this includes taxes paid by industries when they purchase their intermediate inputs, as well as taxes paid by consumers on their final demand purchases. So examples of these are value-added taxes, sales taxes, and import duties. So the focus of today's presentation will be on some of the newest data and features in IMPLAN Canada, and that is the environmental and occupational satellite accounts. The inclusion of these satellite accounts allow for a more holistic view of a particular impact and can also offer powerful insights in addition to impact modeling. So for example, the environmental data can help a region understand how its emissions may have fallen as its industry mix has changed over time. Or it could help a company illustrate how its emissions compare to the industry average emissions. Similarly, the occupation data can help a region develop targeted job training initiatives by identifying skills that may be lacking in the region. Or it could help a business or industry examine regional workforce for site selection. So let's start with the Canada environmental data. So IMPLAN Canada environmental data show the environmental output or the estimates of physical emissions, pollutants, or input use by industry and by region across 8 broad categories. These include air releases, water withdrawals, greenhouse gases, mineral extraction, point source releases to ground and water, transfers, and disposals. And within each of these 8 broad categories, there's detailed data that's available for each pollutant, emission, or input as defined by environment name. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we do that, I want to talk about the different ways that you will be able to access or view the environmental data. So there's 2 different ways of viewing environmental data in the application, in the region details section in the project's results. So the region environmental data provides insights into the model region's current levels of environmental emissions by industry and type of pollutant for a given data year. The environmental impact data provides estimates of environmental impacts by industry and type of pollutant associated with a specific analysis. Both the region and the impact environmental data are available in a summary format grouped by 8 broad environmental categories, or in the detailed format, which is by each pollutant. So let's go ahead and take a look at the region environmental details. This is what the data looks like in the application. So here's an example of region environmental details for the air releases broad category in a national Canada model. I've sorted the air release emissions by estimates of environmental output, and I've focused this view specifically on emissions measured in metric tons. There's a few things that I'd like to point out here. First, the detailed data is available by environment name, and this is the name of the pollutant, mineral, or other substance. The second thing is that for some broad environmental categories, like air releases, we have environment context, or a set of environmental compartments that describe the flow origin or destination. So for example, air releases can occur through stack emissions, which are direct confined releases through chimneys or vents or stacks, or they could be through fugitive emissions, which are unintentional or non-point source air releases, such as leaks or evaporation. So I want to highlight that, I've honed in on the emissions in metric tons, but there's another part of the table that I'm not presenting here, and those are for pollutants that are measured in different units of measurement. So there are other units of measurement, and that depends on the data element of interest. So in this broad air release category, we also have pollutants such as lead and arsenic that are measured in kilograms. I also want to highlight that this slide is particularly looking at the region as a whole, but users can also filter by industry to better understand releases for a particular industry. The last thing I want to call to your attention is this units per dollar of output column. This is the bridge between the economic data and the environmental outcomes, and this is what we use to generate those estimates. So before we move on, I just want to take a moment to note that our environmental data is updated annually. And so for a complete list of pollutants, emissions, and inputs, as well as their units of measurement, you would go to the Canada Environmental Release Notes. So now we have a sense of what environmental data looks like in IMPLAN, but how are these estimates derived, and what raw data sources do we use to do this? So in the interest of time, I won't go into the details, but very broadly, IMPLAN starts by gathering environmental data sets from several different government agencies, such as Statistics Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada. IMPLAN's data team then allocates physical emissions, pollutants, or inputs to IMPLAN industries, and we develop national level ratios of physical emissions, pollutants, or inputs per dollar of industry output. So this is what I was talking about before. Finally, the IMPLAN software applies these national level ratios to regional industry output and impact results. So as I mentioned previously, the units per dollar of output ratio is a critical bridge in between the economic data and the environmental outcomes. And when it's paired with regional data available in IMPLAN, it transforms these national trends into local insights. So this slide provides a list of the government agencies and the specific data sources that we use in the production of the Canada environmental data. I won't go into detail about this, but we do have a detailed support article on this on our support site, which is support.implan.com. You can just search for Canada environmental data and an article will pop up. Let's go ahead and move to the occupation data. So this is occupation and core competency data. So occupation data adds detail beyond wages and salary employment headcounts. So while standard implant industry data provides information on the number of jobs or the total employee compensation paid by an industry, occupation data breaks those totals down into specific job titles, wages, hours, and core competencies required for those roles. So you'll note that here we're only talking about wage and salary employment. So that's an important note because the occupation data does not apply to proprietors. Now, just like the environmental data, there are two different ways of viewing the occupation data in the application. So this is in region details and in project results. So in the region occupation data, you can glean some insights into a model region's occupational composition. Occupation impacts can provide estimates of the occupational impacts by industry and occupation associated with a specific analysis. So the IMPLAN Canada occupation data classifies occupations in accordance with Canada's National Occupational Classification System, or NOC. This system classifies Canadian occupations hierarchically according to their broad occupational category, which is primarily based on the type of work performed or the industry of employment, as well as the training, education, experience, and responsibilities category, or the tier category. So the first digit of the code represents the broad occupational category. So for example, natural resources, agriculture, and related production occupations start with the digit 8. Health occupations, on the other hand, start with the digit 3. The second digit corresponds to the type and or the amount of training, education, experience, and responsibility that is typically required to work in an occupation. So a 1 in the second digit, as seen in the top box there, means that the occupation usually requires a university degree. A 3 in the second digit means that the occupation requires a college diploma, an apprenticeship training of less than 2 years, or more than 6 months of on-the-job training. So each additional digit up to the 5-digit unit group code adds more detail to specify the nature and characteristics associated with a given occupation. The most detailed code is the 5-digit unit group code, of which there are 516 occupations, and you have access to this data in IMPLAN. So let's go ahead and take a look at what occupational metrics are available in IMPLAN. So when looking at Canada occupation data, you'll find the following metrics. You'll find occupational employment. So this is the head count of employees within a specific occupation. You'll find occupational employee compensation. This is the total remuneration paid to employees in that occupation. And you can actually break it out into wage and salary income and supplements to wages and salaries. And finally, you'll see occupational hours, which is the total annual hours worked by persons employed in that occupation. Again, this data is available for at all 5 occupation aggregation levels, as well as by industry or region. So let's take a look at what it looks in IMPLAN. So here we are looking at the industry occupation detail table in the region details section of the application. And again, I'm looking at a national Canada model. And you can see that I've filtered here to the forestry and logging industry. I've also sorted by wage and salary employment. So we can see here that the occupational makeup of this industry includes occupations like logging and machinery operators, transport truck drivers, forestry professionals, But it also includes occupations like administrative assistants in the 15th row there, and accounting technicians and bookkeepers. So how are these estimates derived? Well, the good news is that it's very easy to understand because the process for IMPLAN Canada occupation is very, very similar to the process for Canada environmental. So our data team leverages several national data sets to build an industry occupation matrix. This framework defines exactly how employment and wages are distributed to occupations across every sector. So, for example, in the forestry and logging industry, the raw data show that 17.4% of the workforce and 18.2% of total employee compensation are concentrated in a single unit group occupation, which was the logging and machinery operators, the top row in that previous slide. And then just like the environmental data, the IMPLAN software applies these national level ratios to regional data and impact results. In this case, it applies it to the industry wage and salary employment and employee compensation. Finally, based on those estimates, those wage and salary employment occupations, we add core competency data based on each occupation's required core competencies. So core competencies include not only the individual characteristics and requirements of a role, such as abilities, knowledge, skills, and personal attributes, but it also includes information about the daily task requirements and the structural and environmental conditions of a role under which those tasks are performed. So in IMPLAN, core competencies are available by region, by industry, and by occupation. So I've provided an example here of what the core competencies look for the forestry and logging industry. So you can see here that the most important skill for occupations in this industry is operation and control, which is the capability to maneuver and control operations of equipment, machines, vehicles, or systems. And intuitively, the most important factor in regard to work context is that the job requires working outdoors and being subject to variations in weather conditions and seasonal weather patterns. So one thing to note here is that the competencies required for an industry are based on the occupations within that industry. So it really is the composition of occupations in each industry that provides that industry detail. You'll see in the application that competencies are evaluated using competency points. So basically, the competency points indicate the importance of a specific competency relative to other competencies in that same category. So for example, in the forestry and logging industry, operation and control is important, is relative to skills like digital literacy or negotiating, of which the industry requires relatively less of based on the occupation composition within that industry. So on the support site, we do have a downloadable file with all of the core competencies with their definitions. So here again is a slide that lists the specific data sources that we use in the production of IMPLAN Canada occupation. I won't go into details, but if you would like more detailed information about this, we do have a article about it on our support site. You can just search for Canada occupation data, and it goes into quite a bit of detail there. So before we move into a real world application that Eric is going to lead us through, let's just take a quick moment to review. So with the incorporation of environmental and occupation data, we've moved beyond basic employment counts and industry output. you now have the power to map a project's total footprint from the air emissions that it generates to the exact skills by the local workforce. This is the most comprehensive view of the Canadian economy available in IMPLAN to date. And the most exciting thing is that it is available at high levels of granularity in terms of geography. It is available down just at the sub-provincial level in terms of specific pollutants, and as well with detailed occupation data up to the 516 unit group code. So I am going to pass it over now to Eric to put the IMPLAN Canada data to work.
Thank you so much, Ashley. As Ashley said, now that we have a better understanding of what are some of the new features, what is all the data that's included with IMPLAN Canada, and where did all that data come from, the next step is to look at how we can put that data to work. So today, I want to take a look at a real-world scenario in which we're going to see an provincial level impact and look at it down to the sub-provincial area impact and talk about how we can apply the occupation and environmental metrics to help us figure out a strategic recovery plan. So let's set the stage. We're going to set the stage by considering what's been going on in the forestry related industries in British Columbia. As you can see from this infographic here, there's been a lot of closures, some permanent, some short-term, a lot of curtailments that has gone on in the forestry and timber-related industries in British Columbia. All told, there's been about 15,000 plus forest sector jobs lost across all of British Columbia. Now, these numbers on the slide speak for themselves. They tell that this industry has been hit really hard. And as you would expect, the ripple effects across the communities are pretty significant. This is exactly the type of scenario where IMPLAN can help quantify these broader economic impacts. But in particular, we're going to zoom in on the Nechako region. As one example, in December 2024, this Camphor Plateau sawmill closed after 85 years of production. That was just one of several closures or production cuts that hit this region at the same time. The headline story was that there were about 550 direct jobs lost, a hit of over 11% to the tax base. But we know that this is only part of the picture, that there's much broader, wider economic impacts. And even bigger, thinking one step beyond that, the problem now is, how are we going to help pivot to revitalize this area? Before we jump too much into that, I want to talk about why it's so important to look at this at the local level. British Columbia is massive and diverse. And this is something, if you saw our previous webinar, that Ashley touched on a little bit. But if you're looking at British Columbia as a whole, you're really not seeing the representative impact in the Nechako region. Specifically, we're not accounting for the fact that sawmills aren't just part of a very wider economy in Nechako. They're really the backbone of the economy. So if we look here, we see that sawmill jobs in Nechako represent about 7% of the jobs and about 21% of the output. That is specifically in the sawmill industry itself. But if we look at the table on the right, we see that in addition to that sawmill industry, there are a lot of forestry and timber and sawmill related industries that have these interdependencies, things like forestry and logging, truck and transportation. And really, we could probably go ahead and put a green star up beside all of these, because the existence of all of these is lying on that backbone of the sawmill industry. The point here is that if we only looked at this through the provincial lens, the British Columbia lens, we can only think of provincial solutions. But if we look at this at the sub-provincial data, we can start to think about a very localized, community-specific transition plan. So let's take a look in the Nechako region. If we just model these numbers in an impact analysis, just a simple employment industry event, we can see the wider spread ripple effects. Right? These are the effects on the side of IMPLAN that most people are familiar with and utilizing today. We can do things like talk about the total loss and contribution to the GDP, the total overall employment, direct employment that we're losing. We can also look at the top industries impacted by these shutdowns. Like the first table I showed you, and like Ashley talked about a little bit, I like this because it lets us see how all of these economies and all these industries are related within the economy. We see where the top industries in the indirect supply chain are, right? Our industry where the event is sawmills and wood preservation, but we see that these effects ripple through forestry and logging, support activities for forestry, truck and transportation, all things that if we take a step back and think intuitively are things that we would expect to be affected down the supply chain for sawmills. But we want to move beyond this. And this is what I want to stress, that the occupation and environmental data is one of the tools in IMPLAN that lets us do this. So what people don't always realize is that there's a much bigger story to look at, especially if we're thinking from a development and solutions perspective. So we talked about the sawmill industry as a whole and the standard economic indicators that we see in an economic impact analysis. But what we're pulling here now is from IMPLAN's occupation data, particularly the side of it that Ashley talked about on our impacts after we run an analysis. This directly is telling us what are the occupations where these wider spread impacts are being felt. And places like laborers and processing and manufacturing, all the way down to our occupations. And these are just the top 10 that I pulled off the table, but all the way down to our occupations in natural resources and fisheries. Right? So we're moving beyond in the occupation impact from saying people who worked in the sawmill industry to looking more closely at what are those people doing, and even beyond those people in the sawmill industry, those people being affected by those ripple effects. What were they doing? Similarly, we can look at the competencies like Ashley talked about earlier. And if we look at the competencies that are associated with these occupations, we see things like stamina, depth perception, multi-limb coordination. So where can we put these all to use, right? We can start to think of this as a representative pool of skills. These skills can help us think strategically about how we want to move forward in recovery. For example, let's suppose that you're an economic developer and you're responsible for providing a report on 2 potential industries being targeted to help revitalize the economy. On the left, we see the wood pellet plant, construction capex of 15 million, an estimated annual output of 9.2 million, and 35 direct jobs. And on the right, we see the second option, the gold mine, with a $15 million capex, 14.5 million estimated annual output, and 50 jobs. If we just look at this, we think, oh, that gold mine, it seems shinier and prettier. No pun intended. It's got, while it has the same capex, it's going to bring more jobs, and it's going to have a higher annual output. But the point is that our environmental and occupation data lets us think about this more strategically and more critically. Right? If we expand our view to include the occupation and environmental data, it lets us see beyond these initial shiny numbers. And when we dig further into these 2 potential incoming industries, we see 2 important parts of the story that were previously hidden. For example, the metal mine requires some specialized knowledge that doesn't overlap as well with the currently displaced workforce. So while these mining jobs pay well and might be higher in number, they're going to require either that we bring in talent, we import talent, or that we retrain the existing talent pool. Not that this isn't an option, but it's something to be aware of when we're thinking about what we want to bring in to revitalize the economy. Secondly, the two industries have different environmental impacts. In particular, if we're looking at the gold mine, it has a higher and more significant water withdrawal per unit and a higher particulate air emissions per unit. In this region, this is particularly crucial because the Chaco region is tied to the salmon run and also to indigenous land rights. So when we start to think about these environmental issues and these occupational issues, we see real world costs and considerations and risks that we need to think of when we're considering our development strategy. So where do we go from here? How do we put this all together? What's the story and the takeaway that we really want you to leave with today? Beyond knowing the new features that are in Canada IMPLAN and how you might use them, right, we can see where they really have their advantages. First, we started with a map that showed circles of closure around all of British Columbia. But as the data showed, in this case, locality really matters. That is something that IMPLAN Canada provides by allowing you to look at the national level all the way down to the sub-provincial level. The second point that we saw is that we can sort of reframe the way we think of lost jobs as representing available assets in the economy. So job losses, while they are loss of title, they really represent a pool of skills. They're not a loss of talent from the region. And when you think of it in that context, you can make informed strategic decisions about a development and recovery path. And finally, we can use the environmental data to help us make more informed decisions. And we can think about planning strategically for sustainability. As we saw in this use case, this economic transition, while it's unfortunate that this is happening, it can be the right time for us to start to think about a sustainable economic development plan. Okay, so at this point, before we move forward with the Q&A, we do want to put up a poll. So our development team here is always looking for feedback about new features. And one thing, now that you've seen these use cases and what's available in IMPLAN data in IMPLAN Canada, one of the things we are considering is adding a scope 1, 2, 3 guide to the IMPLAN Canada product. So I want to launch a poll and see what you all think about this, if this is something that would be of interest to you or something that is not as relevant. So how interested would you be in a feature that reports annual scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emission for Canada within IMPLAN? This is not a very opinionated bunch. We're not getting many responses. No, nobody has a thought or opinion out there. All right, that's all right. Let's move along. Okay, so a couple things before we open up the floor for Q&A. First, if you have something on your mind, something you think you'd like to look more into with IMPLAN Canada, you are welcome to schedule a demo at implan.com/demo-request, or you can always email someone at sales@implan.com. Through this demo, you can take a closer look at what is included in IMPLAN Cloud, how to run your specific project, ask all the questions you want, and everything you need to know about IMPLAN. In addition, if you are already an active IMPLAN user and you want more information about IMPLAN Canada or you want to look into a subscription, please be sure to reach out to your customer success team at support@implan.com. And then finally, we always encourage you, Ashley brought it up a couple times, our support site has much more detailed information about data sources, data methodology, use cases, etc. If you haven't explored it, I really recommend it. And that is support.implan.com. All right.
Eric,
And finally,
I was going to say
yes.
before we jump into Q&A, it looks like the poll did not go off. It popped up for a moment and then it went away. So if we can try that
Oh,
again, that would be great. It
let's try.
seems like
Thank you for that feedback. Okay.
yeah, it looks like there are some people that may be interested. So
Is that poll showing now?
it is
Yes.
now.
All
Yes.
right. Great. I did wonder why everyone was so active on the first and nobody on this one. So thank you for your comments on that. Great. We'll give everybody a second. And this is a good time that you can go ahead and put those questions in the Q&A box as well.
Yeah, I can answer a couple of them as people get going here. It says, do you have similar data sets for Mexico? We do not currently have environmental or occupation for Mexico. Mexico is covered in our international product, but we do not have the additional data and functionality that Canada has at this moment. Another question was about the water withdrawal data. They were asking where they could access that. So the in if you're just talking about you want to see the data, you can go to the region details page, and you would go click on environmental, region environmental details. And what you would want to do is you would want to filter to water withdrawals in that environment category. So those are those broad 8 categories. And then you could additionally filter by industry.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. Very efficient use of our time. All right. I am going to go ahead and share the results so you can see that there are a number of you that are actively pursuing ways to do this, how to cover the scope 1, 2, 3, how to report the scope 1, 2, 3 annual greenhouse gas emissions for Canada. Like I said, that's something that is on the roadmap for our development team. So this is great feedback for them. If you're not familiar with scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting, we do, one, have a previous webinar on scope 1, 2, and 3, and we also have great support site content about what scope 1, 2, and 3 is. There have been some new legislation that is making scope 1, 2, and 3 annual reporting necessary and required, particularly here in the US for people doing business in California. And one of our new features in the US is a annual scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas reporting guide. So again, if you want more information about what scope 1, 2, and 3 is, what we're talking about, I do recommend that you take a look at the support site or one of our previous webinars. All right. Thank you all so much for attending today. I really want to encourage you, if you have additional questions that pop up at any time, then please let me know. It does look like we have one more. We have a couple more. I'll get to the last one. It's a quick one in our remaining time. Does IMPLAN have plans to develop further geographic granularity for the Canada models? Smaller geographies than the current economic region.
At this point, there really isn't the raw data to support that. When we were exploring sub-provincial data, economic region was the geographic scope that seemed most appropriate and had the most data available. So at this point, the answer is no. And if we did not get to your question, we will respond directly to you. So please don't hesitate to reach out, and we will get back to you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all. We appreciate your participation, and we hope to hear from you soon. And like Ashley said, those of you we didn't get to your questions live, we'll be sure to answer those. We'll get back to you.
Thank you.